So, just a very brief update about myself prior to anything else. Uh, while I was squatting, while getting up, had this distinct sensation of air coming out of my ear. It's not something that I had experienced before. It was truly novel for me, and it worried me a little. So I looked it up on the internet, and I found that people with similar experiences often went on to find that they may have had a perforation in their eardrum. Now, often it's not a complete perforation. I mean, there are layers to this. There's the outer ear, the middle ear, and the inner ear, and things of that nature. I'm not a medical professional, so I'm not familiar with these. However, I did go to one to get it checked, and he had a look at my ear under with a long tube which had something like a magnifying glass at the end of it with a bit of a light and stuff, which really shows you the canal and everything of that sort. And he said that, well, thankfully, I don't have any perforation in my ear. And he said that it might have had to do with ear pressure. And we did a few exercises like holding the nose and exhaling hard without letting any air come out to see if anything was noticeable. And honestly, the only thing I managed to achieve at that point was to squirt some little dirt out of my eye. That aside, he was yet to be able to explain to me properly as to why I actually felt air coming out of my ear, which had not happened to me earlier. Yet, anyway, since it was found that my eardrum was not perforated, I was given the go clear. He said that in case I am concerned, I can use some ear drops for wax buildup, which he says that my ears have a tendency to, which sounded reasonable enough. Yet, for this consultation and nothing else, I had to pay 1,000 rupees to Apollo Hospital and 300 rupees just to register myself as a patient. Now, think about this for a moment. There can be someone who experiences a novel symptom with their body, something that they do not know, something that they do not understand, something that they have not experienced before. And they may learn from other people's experiences, and if it doesn't resolve what that was, they may seek guidance from an expert, such as a doctor. Now, for that consultation alone, a total of 1,300 rupees is chalked up. And I can't help but think that this may be a model which a institution such as a hospital actually uses. The fact that very often, even if an issue is not resolved, even if what may have been the cause of a certain occurrence is not pinpointed, the fact that you go through a receptionist past a door to someone who is a designated doctor, that act alone is chargeable by the institution, irrespective of whether they do or do not have an answer that resolves your query. Just to give you a brief indication of the kinds of circumstances that I come with in terms of experiences that lead me to be suspicious of such practices. So prior to coronavirus actually breaking out in India, prior to even reports of it coming out on the web or on any news agencies, I was a sub-editor at the Statesman newspaper, where I was making the city pages for Odisha, and once a week I used to make a national page. Now, I'm not sure precisely why it occurred. I'm sure there has been no kind of follow-up regarding the hygiene at the workspace. But let me just tell you that it was, or rather where I was stationed, was a fairly filthy environment by any standards, in the sense that there were rats scurrying around the floor, peeping out of dustbins, strewn papers of, those chalmuris that they sell in trains, like people would leave it lying about, and I guess that attracted the rats. There was a false ceiling that might not have been cleaned in that decade. There was a central air conditioning unit that was probably installed a couple of decades ago, and God knows when it was cleaned last, and that was circulating air throughout. It was pretty inhospitable, to the extent where that particular floor had no access to drinking water. Like, you would actually find moss and mosquito larvae in the aqua guard, the only one on that floor. So people carried their own bottles and stuff of that sort. Now, I may not have been the only one, yet I was one who did contract a fairly bad viral infection there. Now, I'm not sure precisely which virus it was. I'm not sure whether it's been documented. I'm not sure if the doctors picked it up. However, it was a viral fever. It had symptoms such as causing me difficulty in respiration. I was bedridden for over a week and had to be transported to another place, in fact. And I'm really not sure whether, things like the classification of viruses, when do they pop up, when does it become noticeable, when do the defining characteristics of a certain virus become identified, when does a medical practitioner deem it consistent enough for a name to be placed upon it. These are procedures that obviously take a degree of exposure and time. And sometimes there would be people in circumstances who have to face situations without the foresight that is gleaned via these procedures. And in that sense, they are exposed in ways which are often not within the purview of pre-established medical practice. In the sense that tomorrow, lo and behold, it is possible that there may be a new virus that comes and plagues us. At that point, and let us just say that that point will occur, because none of us are here going to pretend that there will be no new virus that ever comes to cause an infection. Would we be waiting for all of these procedures to be institutionalized, for it to be distributed via the media, for governments to step in and say that, oh, this and this and this policy should be followed, for masks to be implemented, for the year and a half effort for a vaccine to be developed, and so on and so forth? Or would we expect something else apart from what was already happening in our healthcare system? And I think unavoidably we would have to opt for the second option, because there may be circumstances and there may be consequences for following what it is that we have, which we may not be in a position to repeat. So at some point, I guess we would have to consider what these changes in policy would be. What can we expect from a medical health provider apart from the ruling out of pre-existing diagnostics? I mean, what would impel someone in such a situation to be able to provide an answer that is satisfactory, not merely to an elimination of identified ailments which are in the public sphere, but which can actually explain to any given patient who comes up to a desk as to what it is that they may have been experiencing, what may have caused a certain symptom, whether it may be indicative of certain lifestyle choices, whether it may be drawn from certain dietary practices, whether it may be some other phenomena at all. Because I think at which level that gets picked up on is very crucial. Like, of course, there will be always people who are stationed in a lab, who look at new cases, who study samples, and so on and so forth. Yet I think once we remove the place of so quote unquote research from the place where any kind of administration vis-a-vis treating those symptoms occur, then we have already created a certain kind of disconnect that becomes very hard to bridge beyond a certain time frame, and it causes consequences, lapses in the chain of communication that people suffer from. Now, I bring this up, and I guess in many ways not in isolation from the circumstances via which we get to learn about what it is that is happening in the world. Now, there's been a lot of talk about, or rather, irrespective of, I guess the social media wave has risen and subsided, yet a lot of people still depend upon the internet, on blogs, on apps, on channels on TV for the information that they consume, via which they learn about what's happening in the world beyond the confines of their own home and maybe their local market, maybe the school they go to, maybe the place of work, and so on. And very often, these institutions themselves depend upon uh, information exchanges from other institutions. For example, at the bare minimum, a shopkeeper who stocks shelves would have to keep track about which products move, which products do not, and have a registry which allows them to refill stocks accordingly. They may have to, of course, deliver groceries and things like that if they offer those services. A school would at least have to have an attendance register for its office, and things of that nature, which entail that they would have to have, I guess, proof of residence of people and things like that. So there's a sense in which there's an unavoidability about pointing out the interdependence between institutions. I mean, they would simply be non-functional without it. Whenever we are discussing any such means of assimilation, we have to deal with what are the roots. I mean, where do people actually pick up keys or cues regarding what is going on in the world? And for better or worse, irrespective of advances in citizen journalism, people taking a selfie stick and maybe reporting on a new protest that may be happening somewhere, the prime sources for even established news agencies remain bulletin subscriptions from institutions such as the Press Trust of India, from private bulletin subscriptions such as those owned by individual newspapers and things of that sort. These are recirculated and pushed onto news channels. And I guess, like, if you really want to get down to the absolute nitty gritty of it, there are WhatsApp groups organized for people called feeders, who actually get paid, I think, a tokenistic 100 rupees or so upon information point or things of that nature. So if something is happening in so and so locality, they probably hear from some source and upload it to whichever agency that happens to be employing them and things of that kind. And there's a way in which someone in a editorial capacity at some minimal level makes a decision saying that, oh, this story has to go up the organizational infrastructure to be reported, maybe sent to an editor, maybe its facts are clarified compared to other reports, compiled and put into a story, which is then formalized onto a page, and a picture, headline is made, and then it's printed the next day and circulated. And in the meanwhile, it's already agency information, so it's probably sold to subscribers, which may include TV channels, which may include apps, and so on and so forth. Now, what's worrying here? At one level, any kind of fact finding would have to draw from sources which are not always primary, and there is no reward to be found in finding the first impulse which led to a story breaking out. I mean, as much as you may glorify whichever doctor found out which was patient X and so on, by that point, it is already far gone beyond anything that can be treated at the level of one individual, if we are talking about a virus. And at some level, our response to such a situation cannot simply be in terms of containment, as effective as that may be. For as China has shown us, it has been able to, in many ways, circumvent the kinds of issues that other countries had to deal with by being able to quarantine the areas where these infections were spreading, and this literally saved thousands, if not millions, of lives. There are people like epidemiologists who study the spread of diseases and infections. Yet, I think once they have already established their set of procedures, if they already know what they are looking for, that, oh, this virus has X and Y and Z characteristics, and we will call it a coronavirus because it has a crown-like structure upon its cellular membrane or whatever, then there's a way in which questions such as its origin, maybe not the origin of the virus itself, maybe not the origin of that particular virus, but environments which permit for the uh, creation, the gestation, the evolution of such viruses, whether they be unsanitary conditions, whether it may be something as simple as an empty exposed septic tank, whether it may be like an unclean central air conditioning unit. Uh, these would be sites which, for God forbid, unholy reasons, become the domain of, I don't know, the floor in charge or something of that nature. And it is really these kinds of disconnections which make the actionable content of any countermeasure frustrated by uh, basically organizational issues. I mean, that's how I think about it. Is there some way in which the person who is like a public health inspector can be incentivized to get in touch with people in a laboratory upon an inspection? Are there, for example, uh, people within an administrative capability who are accountable to such people? These are questions that I think are required to be taken up to the point where they simply cannot be ignored in today's circumstances. And it really does not end here. I mean, for example, the modern workspace, I mean, what is it? Effectively, if you are, like, seriously, even if you are involved in industrial manufacture, uh, you are still today effectively operating a machine which operates some sort of assembly. If you are involved in any sort of media at all, you are effectively upon a computer. If you are I mean, the only exceptions that I can think about this are, for example, people who deal with a direct consultation with a patient, let's say a doctor patient relationship, and I'm not getting into the dissatisfactions there. You effectively are dependent upon what it is that you know about the world, which is a function of what is shareable, what becomes institutionalized, what is passed on as a reputable story, and the checks and measures which any story has to go through for it to get to that point have, I think, today reached a point where they no longer are in a position to respond to something that is happening which requires an immediate intervention. And that, I think, is the prime cause of concern. Uh, and it's really ironic because, like, you would think that in a place where, in today's world, where basically any story becomes instantaneously shareable, let's say if you see uh, a robbery taking place, you can literally take out your phone and call the police. uh, the question becomes as to what would require an institution, what would be required by an institution for it to think of an occurrence as a phenomena that calls for their action. And this is where some ambiguity lies vis-a-vis decision making at, I think, at some level, a administrative position which chooses or chooses not to act upon, let's just call it, actionable elements. I'm not sure as to what kind of debate is going along these lines, whether these questions are being taken up, because I think that it is increasingly worrying if they are not being taken up, because it highlights the degree of insularity that certain positions which ought to be held accountable for the responsibilities that are beholden to them are in a position simply to ignore. Uh, and there's a way in which, like, even grievance addressal systems, let's say let's say that you're a online publisher, let's say you're running a blog. I mean, what would make that channel of information, let's say a guy with a cell phone out on the street notices a story, let's say hoarding of potatoes, decides that he'd share it to some people concerned, uh, for whatever reason, some news editor thinks that it's not really exciting, so it gets passed and it gets passed, and finally he thinks that, oh, well, let me just share it myself. He puts it up in a blog. Uh, what would actually sustain such an effort? I mean, which may effectively break a story. Like, think about what it would mean for that person to actually, maybe while passing by a certain sabzi mandi on his day-to-day commute, to notice something and actually think upon himself to be beholden to his fellow customer, if nothing else, to maybe tell them that, well, maybe you shouldn't buy uh, potatoes from this place, maybe you can buy it from that place because this fellow hikes the price or whatever. At some level it becomes, how does the form in which that communication is shared, how does that become reproducible? And I really think that's the key. That's where institutions step in, that's where they formalize practices. And there are n number of difficulties with forms. They are flawed forms. There are forms which are incapable of taking into account considerations and circumstances which are happening presently. There is no way we can deal with any of these without going actually through the form. You may have to address it, you may have to point out the weaknesses of it to the authorities concerned so that they are aware of what they may or may not be excluding. You may learn whether it is a conscious decision or not. They may provide you a reasoning for it. If they do not, it is really up to you to find out as to on what basis that exclusion was made, because sometimes those people are simply not thinking about anything beyond just filling in a certain format and passing it on to the next chap on the table. It is moronic, it is idiotic. Sadly, it gets institutionalized. I mean, there are people on desks right now doing precisely the same thing. It's a travesty. That aside. So let's just go back to our example, the guy with the blog. Let's take the example of eBlogger. eBlogger is probably blogger.com. It has, I don't know how many thousands or millions of blogs presently. What makes any of them reproducible? What makes them shareable? Let's use the most standard means of monetization, the placement of advertisements on those pages. This is a strategy used even by newspapers, it's used by magazines, it's used by radio, it is used by TV channels in various configurations and so on. Now, it's really possible to apply for a advertisement license, like a Google AdSense plugin, and wait for like 7 or 8 years for an approval. Now they have X number of criterias. The blog would require to have exciting content. It should not be plagiarized and things like that. And for whatever it's worth, even if you don't change the content, maybe the person who's making that decision no longer is making that decision and has moved on elsewhere. Someone new might come into that same spot and decide that, oh, well, no, this actually does make sense. I'm going to approve of this one. And you have all sorts of regulators in such positions, like not just on AdSense and Google, but even on like Facebook and Twitter, people who flag objectionable content. Any group on Facebook, for example, has admins whose responsibility it is to monitor what kinds of content get posted, what do not get posted, whether it's hate speech or not, and so on and so forth. Now, obviously, I think these kinds of responsibilities are far better situated when they get aimed at sites or domains which actually expunge hate speech, such as, well, political platforms. That aside, let's leave this example in the realm of social media. If someone actually has to wait that long, they are not going to be incentivized to share a story. They may literally let something die before they decide to share it because, well, there doesn't seem to be any kind of institutional incentive to share it, and they have a life to lead. And it is this disconnect, I guess, which is what I'm still referring to, and it is symptomatic of what causes the kinds of problems we are really dealing with. and without them being highlighted, without them being taken to the authorities concerned, without forcing them to confront issues like this, I do not think that there would be any reasonable, implementable solution that can be chalked out between people who make policies for an institution and the customers they are designed to serve. Like people talk about uh, readership and things like that going down. People talk about institutions shutting down because of a public contagion. And really, I mean, at some level, we need to confront the fact that the mediating responsibilities that the institutions that we had entrusted with, let's say, the responsibility of providing us with information regarding what is happening in the day-to-day affairs, regarding the education of children, regarding the care of the health of our young and old and middle-aged people, regarding governance and so on, at some point have decided or were not able to glean uh, glean information about developments that are happening that required an addressal, which was not merely someone going to a spot and saying that, oh, yes, I can see this, but actually someone with the capabilities to understand that certain circumstances might have been a problem, to be able to convey those circumstances to the institution concerned and to maybe parallel authorities. I mean, think about this. There are auditing agencies, there are chartered accountants, there are news agencies, there are banks. All of them depend upon each other in very different ways. Uh, I guess the point is, when does one take an active interest in the other, which is significant enough for it to want to intervene in a procedure? And really, the link there, if it is left to only debt, then at some point someone would have to have a look at, okay, well, who is incurring these debts? Where is uh, some sum of money not moving? And that's where we do require people to highlight the responsibilities of auditors and to bring them to notice that, well, there may be institutions, there may be employers that have not been paying wages and things of that nature. A few days ago on Twitter, I posted asking about whether there is an index of employers who are defaulting or have defaulted on wages. And really, this would be a large list, yet it is necessary to start somewhere. I think there is a hashtag called Unpaid Britain that's actually putting together some sort of compendium of such information. And it really would be a progressive step for a political platform such as the Congress, maybe the left, the BJP, anyone, to take up such an issue and to be able to say that, well, okay, we will be able to address some of these systemic issues when we can ensure that the factors that create an inertia in the process are no longer as significant as they are. And unless this becomes something that is public, that can be scrutinized, it would remain behind a closed door, something that you would require to scratch palms to, maybe go through a receptionist to learn a little bit about, and maybe 2 months later someone in a fairly serious magazine may read an expose, reportage, investigative journalistic piece about how maybe some pharmaceutical company was in cahoots with some industrialist somewhere, and they were maybe uh, bribing doctors to push a certain drug. And these are occurrences which have gotten to the point where they are almost sedimented into the sidewalks of these institutions. And if someone doesn't really look at what's happening, I think it is inevitable that we would have public health issues, pandemic or not, sooner rather than later. And these are some of the concerns that I wanted to share with you today. These are concerns that in many ways affect my life presently today. I think they affect other people's lives as well. And were we to be able to create some sort of call for these issues to be addressed perhaps via the means which I have advocated for, we may be able to make some progress on issues that can no longer sit on the back burner, so to speak. Anyway, this was my stupid rant for today evening. I hope it's gotten you to think about some of the kinds of crises we are dealing with, because very often it's not something apparent, it's not something that you will be able to spot at face value. It may require some digging, and for it to become uh, something that can be solved, it may require some sharing, and that's really where we are stuck at presently. And you could say that one of the responsibilities of journalism as the fourth pillar or whatever was to do this, and there has been great progresses made in the recent past with like whistleblowers and things like that, and yet that still deals with a, in many ways, an essential uh, uh, domain, like institutions such as security agencies, which may be hiding critical information from citizens regarding what people employed by the state do in uh, their name in uniform and so on and so forth. Yet that still remains at a distance. You know, it remains at the realm of war or counter-terrorism or some sort of mass fraud, or or maybe if some political figure was involved with some kind of backhand dealings with someone else, that's when something like that becomes a news item which someone might choose to share with an organization like WikiLeaks. Of course, we are talking about people like Bradley Manning and Edward Snowden and so on, and their unfortunate measures which they have had to come to face because of their actions, which do really require some sort of civil cooperation on our part to be able to get behind these people, because really we need them. I mean, were there to have been someone in Wuhan who actually could have told us that, well, there is a highly contagious viral epidemic on the cards in the immediate future, we might have been able to take precautions which we simply did not. This is really what we are up against. And I guess everyone will make their own call regarding how they want to deal with it, who they want to take into account, and what kinds of issues they would raise. And yet, it does really begin somewhere. And I hope you do what it is that you can to bring to notice what affects you in your life and maybe those close to you, to begin with, to the notices of people who can make a difference in these issues. Anyway, no more ranting. Bye bye.